in a noisy little cappuccino coffee shop on Charing Cross, and I am with
Tony Rowe.
I ran into Tony at one of the bookstores on the street that was having a half price sale down the basement, and I noticed that you were looking at some interesting, mostly sort of little documents, little pamphlets and papers and things like that. And then I saw you again on the famous little street. What's the name of that street?
Cecil Court.
And there you were again, so I figured something was up. It turns out you are just doing your rounds, you mentioned, and you own a bookstore.
We used to have a bookstore in Museum Street by the British Museum for about 13 years till we closed last May.
The reason that you closed?
Oh, there are many reasons, but basically old age, if anything.
Oh, old age, that'll do it, yeah. But you also did mention that only within the past year would you have been able to close down the physical store and go online and not really lose any money doing so.
That's right. It changed very fast, the book market, certainly in this country. And
just in the last year?
I mean, it has been changing for 3 or 4 years, but only in the last year has it reached a stage where we could suddenly make as much money on the net as we did with our bookstore.
Basically, that is because more people have found out about your bookstore, and also the fact that you specialize in a particular area?
If you want to make any money on the internet, you have to specialize fairly rigorously if you don't want to compete with the larger booksellers.
So your niche is what?
We do modern fine art, ephemeral items, catalogues, posters, illustrated books.
Specific to, they would be little biographies of and catalogues of modern 20th century artists, or does it matter?
Basically it's 20th century, but running back to the late 19th century.
So Aubrey Beardsley and people like that?
Yeah. Before about 1870 there was no real publishing of that sort of material.
Over the years you developed a mailing list, I assume, of interested potential customers?
Sure, but we've always worked on the basis of buying what we like and then worrying about selling it rather than buying with particular customers in mind.
That's lovely. So you basically just follow your own passion, and you get excited by the little treasures that you find, and then mark them up accordingly?
That's right. I mean, I enjoy that particular area, but also it has advantages in that very few other people are interested in those particular items. If you have that specialist knowledge, then you can make a very good living at it.
This is advice that I've actually received from other booksellers, is rather than running after what everyone else is running after, develop a collection of books in an area that you're really passionate about. Maybe it's your career, or maybe it's places that you went to in your childhood, things you collected or whatever. Would you say that's good advice?
It's good advice if you're in for the long term, because obviously it takes a long time to build up that sort of knowledge and also build up the client base for what are fairly esoteric items. If you were just going in for making money, then you'd do better to just chase the more familiar material.
Like modern first editions?
Modern first editions, antiquarian books, plate books, travel books.
What is it about the art books that fascinate you so much?
Well, I started off as a painter in my long forgotten youth, and I've always had an interest in art. I did a degree in the history of art at university. And it's always nice if you can combine your personal interest with your business interest. But if there's any parents out there, don't put your children into the book business. It's a declining market, I'm afraid, in the long run.
I'm surprised, because I think that given the advent of the internet and e-books and things like this, that the printed word, the printed book may well become scarcer and scarcer, and therefore hopefully the value of them will go up.
They may become scarcer, but the knowledge required to take an interest beyond a superficial level, it's not something you can recreate or pick up easily.
What specifically do you mean?
Well, the level of connoisseurship you need to appreciate rare books it's a dying art, I think.
That's part of why we've got this book show going.
Uh-huh.
Is to resuscitate it.
Certainly in England, the market for antiquarian books, antiquarian prints. That whole market has suffered in recent years, and all the interest now is on modern art, modern first editions, basically simpler material to handle than more esoteric material.
So would this be an opportunity then again for a collector if they, because the demand is down? Is it?
Absolutely. I mean, if you've got the knowledge, you can do very, very well. Finding customers to sell them on to will become increasingly difficult.
And again, you talked about the knowledge several times. Specifically, where should someone start looking? And let's say it's not first editions, modern first editions you're interested in. It's maybe travel books on the Channel Islands, let's say. Is that the type of thing you're talking about? Like they were published maybe in the last century?
I would say you'd be better off learning, say, Latin or Greek, which would open up a vast collecting area in which very few people nowadays have any working knowledge at all.
Just by knowing the language?
Absolutely.
To anyone who doesn't understand the language, these just would be books that make no sense to anyone, or what?
That's right.
I mean, I can see a book that's written in Latin and it's an old book. It seems to me that you'd be better off knowing about who published and the main publishers and a way to determine authenticity rather than learning the language.
Sure, I mean, there's technical knowledge like that, but if you can't read the language, then you're never going to be able to operate at a very serious level.
So where do you find all these works then?
We travel around all over the world, basically, looking for rare material.
And are you willing to give up any of your secrets, or where be a good place for?
In my case, it's books from about 1880 to about 1960.
And books specifically on art?
It's largely books on modern art, but we buy books in any language, which gives us a great advantage in terms of the range of material we're interested in and the opportunities for buying books that other people may not realize the value of.
So can you give me for instance, what would be a really, really wonderful find for you that, only costs £3 or £4 or £5, but would be worth 10 or 20 or 30 times that?
I expect to do that sort of thing every week. It's a necessary part of my cost structure that we do have a fairly high markup. Can
you give me some specific examples of exactly that?
I always hate to give specific examples like that.
Well, you don't have to give me very specific in titles, but can you just a catalogue that was published by the British Museum, for example, would that back in the turn of the century, would that be something that you could pick up cheaply and sell expensively?
Not in our sort of business, but there's a famous English painter called Francis Bacon.
Yes.
Who had
There's an interesting documentary that came out on him not that long ago. I don't know if you saw that.
I didn't.
It was Derek Jacobi.
They showed a Derek Jacobi film just after the documentary. He had a number of exhibitions in his studio in the 1930s. For many years there were believed to be no catalogues of these exhibitions, no catalogues were made, but in fact we bought one of these catalogues about 5 years ago. I think we paid about £8 or £9 for it, and we sold it for £3,000.
I love that. You must have loved that.
Oh, it's always nice and
I love that. Is that what the keeps the fire in your belly, that kind of thing?
Well, that and paying the bills, yeah.
What, paying the bills keeps the fire in the hearth?
Absolutely.
Yeah, okay. That's a wonderful example. And now who would have published that, and then where did you find it?
That would have been published by Bacon himself. I mean, he might have, I doubt if he produced more than 20 or 30 of them.
And where did you find it?
I wouldn't like to say which particular dealer I bought it from.
No, you don't have to, but it was an actual bookseller that...
It was a bookseller who...
in London, Charing Cross, or...
Yeah. But they obviously had no idea what it was.
That's so wonderful. Again, it's basically this knowledge is power thing, isn't it, with selling books. Is you have knowledge, and that's one of the power and thrill of being a collector who has some knowledge. You can go in and you can pick out these gems that few others can.
Well, I think the excitement comes from not knowing what you're going to find at any particular time, but...
Yeah, so every time you go out on one of your rounds, you're filled with potential of getting a little gem.
Sure, and
That's what gets you going in the morning, does it?
and the advantage for us is that we're not looking for particular books. We'll buy anything that catches our eye, whereas those who tread the more well-beaten tracks have less choice in terms of what they buy.
What do you mean well-beaten path?
I mean, if you're a children's dealer, then you're looking to buy Rackhams or Greenaways or whatever it happens to be.
And you mean there's not the wide variety of potential that you might have?
In some ways there is the variety, but you're a hostage to your own specialism.
Because there's just a limited number of authors that you could sell to potential customers?
That's right. Most customers are looking for a fairly narrow range of things. In that particular example, children's books.
Children's books, yeah. Like there's basically they're looking for well-known authors that they may have known about when they were kids, or
yeah.
Whereas for you, basically, it's any painter and any ephemera around any painter. Is that correct?
Absolutely, yeah. There isn't the same hierarchy in terms of who you can collect or not.
Oh, I would think there'd be a hierarchy in the sense that some painters are more decorated and highly regarded than others. But there's more collectors out there of paintings too, I guess.
I think there's a wider range of potential areas that you can sell in than something like children's books. Children's book collectors tend to know what they like, and that's what they want.
And a lot of them like the same thing.
A lot of them like the same thing because, not surprisingly, everyone liking the same thing increases the value of the same thing they're liking.
Exactly, like Winnie the Pooh.
Exactly. Yeah.
This is great. I'm really happy that I bumped into you, and I'm glad I got that great photograph of you with your lovely hat on. Your book, is that your book buying hat?
I'm afraid I have a number of hats. There is a weakness of mine. Old hats.
Do you paint still?
Very occasionally, unfortunately, but you're probably aware that there's even less money in painting than book selling.
Well, I'm glad that you've been able to make a living somewhat related to painting and your passion.
It's been a pleasure all my life.
Wonderful. Thanks. And we've been speaking with Tony Rowe, who has owned a bookstore near the British Museum for the past 13 years, and prior to that...
we had a shop in Chelsea, and we'd moved around a bit before then, but we ran a shop called Rowan Moore in Museum Street.
Very good. Thanks again.
Okay.